Good afternoon. Welcome to the Distinguished Community Engagement Award ceremony for 2016. My name is Michael Kula. I teach in writing studies. I'm a slow learner in some ways, but not with this. No one is here to hear me talk, so I will be very quick about this. Just want to introduce each of the award winners today. So our first honoree is Dr. Charles Emlet. Dr. Emlet has spent over 15 years working with the Puyallup Area Aging and Community Committee to help make the city of Puyallup more age-friendly. What began with Dr. Emlet as a founding member of a task force assessing Puyallup's age friendliness, one of 10 cities in the U.S. selected for this project, developed into community-engaged participatory research with multiple outcomes. Dr. Emlet remains a key member of these ongoing efforts with impacts that include the production of qualitative data about aging and place, policy reports to the Puyallup City government, peer-reviewed scholarly articles, as well as the development of an annual volunteer fair, multi-organization educational forums, and an elder-friendly business certification program. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charles Emlet.
Thank you. A pleasure to be here and spend a little bit of time telling you about what we've been up to for a while. So I've got something in the vicinity of around 25 minutes, and I'm going to try to cover 20 years or 15 years of work in 20 minutes. So, okay, right. There's the limitation. Okay, so what, why should we care about this? How many people in the audience are thinking that you might want to live past age 65? Yeah, okay. How about 75? 85? Yeah, okay, all right. So, it's interesting because especially when I teach undergraduate, my undergraduate aging class, folks always look at it as somebody else. And what I'd like to suggest is one of the reasons that we ought to be concerned about aging is it's us. And you could be, where I'm used to hanging around people like social workers and nurses and healthcare professionals who are very altruistic. The fact of the matter is you could be the most self-centered, narcissistic person on the planet, and you ought to be worried about aging. Because guess what? We're all going to do it or not, right? Oh, that's the alternative, and that's when students go, well, what do you mean there's an alternative to aging? Yeah, it's called dying early. So then, if we kind of look at that micro level and say, okay, if it's ubiquitous, we're all going to grow old, we ought to be worried about it. Then we have to realize that we grow old. We don't grow old in a vacuum, right? So there was this show when I was a kid called Get Smart. And, it was this comedy about these spies, and there was a point where this cone came down. It's called a cone of silence. And, it was kind of this vacuum, and, nothing could get outside of that. Well, we don't age like that. We age in the context of families. We age in the context of communities, and we age in the context of society. And so essentially we want to grow old, and we're going to grow old in the context of a community and a society that's either supportive of that and generative of that, or is prejudicial, discriminatory, and doesn't have the infrastructure to help us. And so we might want to worry about this. We might want to think about it. And therefore, we might want to think about how to make families, but also in this context, communities and societies more age-friendly. This is the wake-up slide. Comes from the Federal Interagency Group on Aging Statistics. And in 2014, there were about 46 million people over the age of 65 in the United States. By the year 2030, which is not all that far from now, we're talking about 74 million people. 21% of the U.S. population will be over 65 in just a few years, about, basically kind of 1 in 5. So another kind of demographic reason to keep this on our radar screen and think about it, again, both in terms of policy and economics and all that, but we're not aging alone either. We've got a nice large cohort of people to do this with. So this work for me really started in about 2001. I came to UWT in 1999. And I had a MSW student who had his placement at Good Sam, and Puyallup was one of 10 cities chosen from throughout the United States to participate in this program called the Advantage Initiative. It was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Atlantic Philanthropies. And the goal of the project was to pick 10 cities and have to do a survey of their older Medicare, a random telephone survey of their older Medicare recipients to see what they thought about their community. It was administered by the Visiting Nurses Service of New York, and the data was actually collected by a group called Westat. At that point, there was a community-based task force that was formed to launch this, and it was a group of providers and politicians, policymakers, and older adults. And it was quite well, I mean, the people, the mayor, the city council, the president of Pierce College. I don't know if any of you remember Senator Jim Castema was a state senator for a long time. His father was on the task force. And so it had a lot of political weight. And we were able to successfully get data from about a little over 500 Medicare recipients in the greater Puyallup area. And we really asked them about whether or not they thought Puyallup was an age-friendly or an elder-friendly community, and by and large, they thought it was. And this really marked the beginning of the elder-friendly city movement in Puyallup. So this has been going on since, roughly around 2001. The results of that survey is nicely published, and so we don't need to go over it here because, I want to spend a little bit more time talking about where we're going and what we're trying to do now than where we've been. So this is in the rearview mirror, and if you want. It was written, co-authored with a colleague of mine from Pierce County Aging and Long-Term Care. So the Advantage Initiative was funded for 2 years. And as often happens, funding goes away. And so did the task force. And so did all the politicians and all the policymakers and the folks that were so involved in this project for a couple of years. And the funding went away, and they went, oh, okay, that's great. See ya. Room was empty. Well, I think we have more work to do. And we have some very, very initial kind of baseline data, but what does this mean and where is this going? So, any historians in the audience? So in feudal Japan, the samurai worked for feudal lords. And if they didn't have a feudal lord, they were called a ronin because they didn't have a boss. So they kind of wandered around. There was this samurai wandering around feudal Japan with no boss, and they kind of didn't know what to do, right? And they tended to get in trouble. And there was this period of time where I felt like we were kind of organizational ronin because the task force had disbanded. And nobody was really taking us on and helping us form where we were going. And so there was this group of kind of stalwart, just stubborn people who refused to quit meeting. And we continued to meet, maybe every month, every other month. And we would try to figure out what we were doing and how do we move our community forward to a more age-friendly place. And so we met stubbornly for a very long time, and sometimes it was 3 or 4 of us meeting around a table every month, kind of looking around going, what are we doing this? But we continued with that work. So we eventually For a while, we convinced the city that we were important enough that they made us a subcommittee of a tiny Puyallup City Government Advisory Committee. So we had a little bit of sanction from the city government. But if you asked any council person, well, how about this committee? They would go, huh, what? I don't know what you're talking about. So eventually, we created what's called the Puyallup Area Aging and Community Committee, and we rewrote our charter. We defined ourselves as an educational and advocacy organization, and as of a few months ago, we finally obtained 501c3 status from the IRS. So we are now a legitimate private nonprofit organization. We're no longer organizational Ronin. And we have a mission, and we have a place that we're moving to. So during that time, we began to do some initial work with the city and the community. One of the things that came out of a community forum we had a number of years ago was that older people were having trouble volunteering. They would seek out volunteer opportunities, and agencies wouldn't get back to them. Or they might be the retired CEO of an organization, and they went to someone and they said, here, you want to volunteer, how about if you stuff these envelopes? That would be really helpful. And so there was this disconnect. So we created, 7 years ago, we just had the 7th annual volunteer fair. And I always like to refer to it as volunteer speed dating. Because what we have is we have a group of agencies, usually between 18 and 25 agencies, that come in and they set up booths, and then the community is invited in to come and see what they've got. And then we basically we let them match each other. So we've done that. We have created an annual educational event during May, every May, because celebrating Older Americans Month. So we have some kind of forum. Sometimes we've been able, with some outside support, to bring in some fairly well-known speakers. Last year we brought in a man by the name of Roger Landry, who's a physician on the East Coast, but his claim to fame was he was the physician of the astronauts. But he's doing a lot of work around aging and positive aging. We continue to do advocacy for policy change at the local level. So for a while back, the Puyallup City Council was looking at the issue of whether or not they should allow the concept of cottage housing. And we felt that really is a good model for a number of people, including older adults. And so we advocated and testified before the City Council, which eventually resulted in them approving the ordinance allowing cottage housing in Puyallup. And in addition, we've had some scholarly and popular press publications that have come out. We've been able to involve students. I had a student do an independent study a couple of years ago and do some really nice research around the concept of elder-friendly businesses. So what is an elder-friendly business, and what components go into that? And so he did some great background work. And then we took that, turned it into some data gathering instruments, and got both survey and focus group information from older adults living in Puyallup on what they think constitutes an elder-friendly business. What do you think was the last thing on the list they cared about least? Discounts. Could care less about discounts. What do you think was on top of the list? Were you at the meeting? Being treated like a human being, doing something to help mitigate ageist attitudes that are very, very prevalent in our society. And so, so one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to work with the Chamber of Commerce, and we'd like to gather the same data from businesses and see what they think. Because our thought is they're probably putting discounts way up at the top. I'll give you 10%. Yeah, but if you treat me like a moron, why would I care about this 10%? And why do you treat me that way? Because of the way I look, the number of years I've been on the planet. And so that's not a very good reason to do that. So one of the things that happened very recently that we're very proud of, and this is not instead of the work that we're doing, but this is sort of a whole nother push and a whole nother arm of this effort, is that Puyallup is the first city in the state of Washington to receive the World Health Organization designation as an age-friendly city. And I'm sorry, but when I learned that we beat Seattle out by about 2 months, I smiled. What can I say? So we've been working very hard. And what is an age-friendly city from the perspective of the World Health Organization? It promotes active aging. So we want people to age well. And how do we do that? We keep people active. We keep them engaged in their community. We keep them engaged in their society and their families. And so this idea of relegating one to the porch and to the rocking chair, that is long, long, long gone. We need to recognize the diversity among older adults. So people over the age of 65 are probably one of the most diverse populations in states, not just in terms of things like race and ethnicity, but just cohort. You can't look at me and look at an 89-year-old World War II vet and suggest our experience of life is the same. So the idea of diversity in the broadest context as we age. Respect decisions and life choices. So as we get older, making those decisions becomes even more important. And yet that's where we, with what Robert Binstock called compassionate ageism, we kind of want to be very paternalistic and say, here, let me make that decision for you. So we want to keep that idea of respectful decision and lifestyle choices in the forefront. And finally, to ensure policies, services, and structures that relate to the physical and social environment that supports activity and good health. So one of the things that we talk about is that, for example, if there's a crosswalk that's too fast and an 80-year-old woman is having trouble crossing it safely, we can work to time that a little bit better. But you know what? I have a 32-year-old daughter with 3 kids under age 6. When she goes to cross that crosswalk, to do it safely, she needs just as much time as an 80-year-old woman. And so the work that is good for an aging city and an aging society is actually good for. So we did apply and became an AARP, World Health Organization, age-friendly city. We received that designation in May of 2016. And we're going to be working on an action plan and development of particular domains in the coming future. So this slide just gives you an idea of how holistic we're looking at this. These are the 8 domains of an age-friendly city that has been identified by the World Health Organization. Transportation, being able to get around, housing, things like cottage housing and other housing options, shared housing, social participation, keeping people engaged in their community and social. Respect and social inclusion. So, again, keeping people integrated. Giving them opportunities for civic participation and employment, and communication and information in a way that isn't ageist. And finally, outdoor spaces and buildings. So what we're doing right now, we're just beginning the process of identifying community stakeholders. And we chose people, or really agencies, based on how they fit into those 8 domains. And so this is a list. I don't need to go over these. The slides are available. But this is the list of people or agencies that have been invited to the stakeholders meetings. And we've now had, I think, 2, and we're getting ready to have our 3rd stakeholder meeting. So the idea then is we'll be pushing this forward from their view of what is most important. So this just gives an idea of the work that we're trying to do. So the question is, what would you like to see in an age-friendly community? And what you see on the slide is the 8 domains, a very brief description of what those are, and then down below the planning process. So we're currently in phase 1. We're looking at preparing and launching the stakeholders group. We're beginning to get information from them and get their ideas. And sometime next year, we'll move into phase 2, which is the development of an action plan. And then ultimately, it'll be the implementation and evaluation of that plan with a total amount of time being approximately 5 years. At the end of that 5 years, we report to the World Health Organization. We tell them what we're doing, we indicate our progress, and they either recertify us as an age-friendly community or not, depending on the work we do and how effective we are. So, some takeaways. When we're talking about community engagement and community change, we're talking about long-term work. So imagine if at the end of that Advantage initiative, at the end of 2 years, when Atlantic Philanthropies and Robert Wood Johnson pulled their money, and 85% of the task force wandered off, what if it would have been 100% of the task force? And said, oh, that was great. We got data from 514 people. Right, wonderful, and Puyallup is deemed by the majority to be elder-friendly. Great, okay, good. Next. So it's that idea of a long-term commitment that I think is really critical when we're talking about a change at the macro level. It's beyond funding cycles and transient interests of governments or foundations, because there always is that kind of interest du jour, right? That funding focus or amount of funding that is very, very time limited, and these kinds of changes have to go beyond that. So we have to find a way in the community change models to sustain our efforts beyond when government or funding foundations or anyone else says, oh, okay, well, we're done, right? The infrastructure may need change. So we went from a task force that was well sanctioned to the kind of organizational Ronin days where we didn't know what we were doing, and now beginning the very early stages of being a 501c3 with a board of directors and moving with some kind of inherent structure in that. So infrastructure may need to change over time. And I think the idea of balance of steadfast yet flexible goals. So we always had that distal goal of creating more of an age-friendly community, but exactly what that looked like needs some flexibility. If you would have asked me 3 years ago about the idea of moving toward a World Health Organization age-friendly community, I would have looked at you like, huh? Right, so we didn't even know what that was. We didn't know what that process was. But it emerged organically, and we were able to say, this is good. This will benefit the community. It'll benefit people of all ages. Let's go for it. And so that idea of a steadfast, ultimate kind of distal goal, realizing there has to be some flexibility in the midst of all that. So age-friendly in practice, what is it? It's by local communities for local communities. So all of these communities has a different way of doing it. Puyallup is Seattle is a very agency-led effort. There's a lot of governmental folks that are around the table, and we've met with them, and we're doing some cross-fertilization and sharing of ideas. Our effort is much more consumer-focused, right? So there's a lot of older people around the table. So each one of these processes, each one of these communities will look a little bit different. If you're interested in this, you can get a hold of me. There's a phone number and email address. Linda Henry is one of my colleagues in this effort that's been really spearheading this for quite some time. And there's a URL for the World Health Organization website on age-friendly communities. So, thank you.